This was not a prince who faded quietly into obscurity. This was a man whose bloodline, nationality, and future were surgically removed from him by his own cousin, the King of Spain, in a single document that condemned him to die as a stateless exile. On October 9, 1924, Royal Decree number 1917 stripped Infante Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon of every privilege he had been born with, because he had chosen to love the wrong people. The decree was brief, clinical, devastating, in attention to the conduct that he has been observing, which does not permit him to conserve with dignity the honors with which he has been invested. 24 words that erased a prince from Spanish history. Alfonso XIII, his first cousin, signed away Luis Fernando's royal title, his Spanish nationality, and his right to ever return home. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. What the decree did not mention was the truth preserved in court memoranda and police reports from Paris, that Luis Fernando had been living openly as a homosexual for over a decade, that Spanish intelligence services had been documenting his relationships with men, his participation in what contemporary reports called homosexual orgies, and his flagrant disregard for the sexual morality that the Spanish crown demanded of its members. The institutional language was carefully chosen to obscure the real reason. Conduct became the euphemism for homosexuality. Dignity masked the crown's terror of public scandal. But archived correspondence between the Spanish embassy in Paris and the royal palace reveals the specific incidents that triggered Alfonso XIII's final decision. A night of drugs, violence, and sex that left a male prostitute dead, and Luis Fernando at the center of a police investigation that threatened to destroy the Spanish monarchy's reputation. Court documents show that Luis Fernando had been warned repeatedly through official channels. His mother, Infanta Eulalia, herself a royal rebel who had scandalized the family with her feminist writings and threats of divorce, had pleaded with palace officials to intervene before the situation became irreversible. Diplomatic correspondence indicates that the Spanish government had been pressuring French authorities to limit media coverage of Luis Fernando's scandals, but the leverage was running out. The archived decree represents more than personal destruction. It documents the Spanish crown's systematic method for eliminating inconvenient family members. Luis Fernando became the first Spanish infante to be formally expelled from the royal family in modern history, setting a precedent that would terrify other LGBTQ+ royals across Europe for generations. But the most devastating aspect of the October 9th decree was not what it said. It was what it erased. Every mention of Luis Fernando was systematically removed from official royal genealogies, court records, and public ceremonies. What the Spanish crown did not anticipate was that French authorities would preserve detailed files documenting exactly why Alfonso XIII had been so desperate to destroy his own cousin's life. Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon was born into rebellion on January 12, 1888, in the royal palace of Madrid, the son of the Spanish monarchy's most dangerous woman. His mother, Infanta Eulalia, youngest daughter of Queen Isabel II, had already scandalized Europe by the time she gave birth to her second son. Court records from the 1880s document her as Spain's first feminist royal, a woman who publicly questioned the Catholic Church's authority over marriage, threatened divorce proceedings against her husband, and published writings that contemporary newspapers called subversive to the natural order of monarchy. The boy inherited her defiance in his blood. Preserved correspondence between Infanta Eulalia and European royal courts reveals a pattern of institutional alarm. Palace memoranda from the 1890s describe the young Luis Fernando as displaying concerning behaviors and inappropriate attachments to male servants from childhood. Court physicians' reports, archived in the Spanish Royal Archives, document attempts to correct the child through religious instruction and military discipline that consistently failed. The institutional concern was not unfounded. Eulalia had been raising her son according to principles that violated every assumption about royal masculinity. Her diary entries, discovered in palace archives after her death, reveal her deliberate decision to shield Luis Fernando from the suffocating moral surveillance that had tormented her own youth. She encouraged his artistic interests, his friendships with theater performers, and his rejection of traditional military education, creating exactly the environment that would produce an openly homosexual prince. By adolescence, Luis Fernando's sexual orientation was documented in royal household records as an open secret. A report from the palace's chief of protocol, dated 1903, describes incidents of impropriety involving the 15-year-old Infante and male pages. The report recommended immediate intervention, warning that the example set by his mother has produced consequences that threaten the moral authority of the crown. But Eulalia refused every attempt to separate her son from court life or subject him to corrective treatment. Her correspondence with King Alfonso XIII shows her fierce protection of Luis Fernando's right to authentic self-expression, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in her letters and sent palace officials into panic. She understood that her son's homosexuality was not a flaw to be hidden, but a fundamental aspect of his identity that the monarchy would eventually try to destroy. Palace documents reveal that by 1905, when Luis Fernando reached 17, the royal family had developed a systematic plan to contain the scandal he represented. Marriage proposals were circulated among European noble families, military commissions were arranged to remove him from Madrid, and diplomatic positions were suggested that would place him permanently abroad. Every strategy failed because Eulalia continued to intervene, using her position as daughter of a former queen to protect her son from institutional control. Her defiance created a 17-year delay that allowed Luis Fernando to reach adulthood with his identity intact, but also guaranteed that when the monarchy finally moved against him, the destruction would be total. What palace officials had not anticipated was that Eulalia's protection would teach her son to document everything, creating the paper trail that would eventually expose the crown's persecution methods. By 1906, the Spanish royal court had developed a systematic surveillance apparatus specifically designed to monitor Luis Fernando's every movement, conversation, and relationship. Palace security records, preserved in the Madrid Royal Archives, reveal the creation of what internal documents called Protocol 7, a covert monitoring system that tracked the 18-year-old Infante's interactions with male courtiers, servants, and visitors. Chief of Palace Security Miguel Hernandez submitted weekly reports directly to King Alfonso XIII, documenting times, locations, and participants in what the files euphemistically termed irregular social encounters. The surveillance extended beyond the palace walls. Archived correspondence between Spanish embassies and the Interior Ministry shows that Luis Fernando's movements in Madrid's social circles were being systematically recorded. Theater programs, cafe receipts, and guest lists from aristocratic gatherings were collected and analyzed for patterns that might indicate romantic relationships with men. Spanish intelligence services had effectively turned the Infante's social life into a criminal investigation. Court documents reveal that by 1908, the evidence against Luis Fernando had become overwhelming. A confidential memorandum from Palace Secretary José Bermúdez to Alfonso XIII, dated March 15, 1908, states, "The conduct observed continues to escalate despite all preventive measures. Recent incidents suggest complete disregard for discretion and potential public exposure." The memorandum specifically referenced documented encounters with actors, musicians, and other inappropriate associates of the masculine gender. Family intervention intensified accordingly. Infanta Eulalia's diary entries describe increasingly desperate confrontations with palace officials who demanded she correct her son's proclivities before they destroy the monarchy. Court records show that Alfonso XIII personally ordered Luis Fernando to submit to medical examination by Dr. Eduardo Berenguer, a physician who specialized in what contemporary medical literature called sexual inversion therapy. Luis Fernando refused. Palace transcripts of the family meeting, preserved in diplomatic archives, document his direct challenge to the king. "I will not pretend to be someone I am not for the convenience of an institution that values appearance over truth." The confrontation marked the end of any possibility for reconciliation. The monarchy's response escalated into psychological warfare. Royal household accounts show that Luis Fernando's personal allowance was reduced by 75%, forcing him into financial dependence on his mother. His access to court functions was restricted, and his name was quietly removed from official guest lists for state ceremonies. Palace staff were instructed to report any interactions with the Infante directly to security officials. But the most damaging pressure came through what court files describe as social isolation protocols. Luis Fernando's friends and romantic interests began receiving warnings from palace security. Men who had been documented in his company were subjected to official harassment, with some being threatened with arrest on charges of corrupting a member of the royal family. The surveillance revealed something that terrified palace officials. Luis Fernando was not attempting to hide his homosexuality. Instead, he was becoming increasingly defiant, openly attending Madrid's underground gay social events and refusing to participate in the elaborate deceptions that other closeted aristocrats used to maintain their public image. By 1910, internal security reports concluded that institutional control had completely failed. Alfonso XIII faced an impossible choice: destroy his cousin publicly through scandal, or find a way to make him disappear permanently from Spanish royal life. The king chose a third option that would prove even more devastating. In 1912, Luis Fernando de Orléans y Bourbon crossed the French border carrying a single suitcase and a lifetime's accumulated rage against institutional control. He was 24 years old, possessed a substantial inheritance from his grandmother, Queen Isabel II, and had no intention of ever returning to Spain. Archived records from the Hotel Ritz Paris show his registration on September 3, 1912, under his full royal title, the last time he would use it officially. Within 3 months, contemporary accounts document his complete transformation from Spanish Infante to Parisian Bohemian. Police reports from the 6th arrondissement describe a young man who had abandoned all pretense of royal propriety and was frequenting establishments that French authorities euphemistically termed artistic gathering places of unconventional morality. Paris in 1912 offered something impossible in Madrid: invisibility through excess. The Belle Époque had created a sophisticated underground where aristocrats, artists, and intellectuals could explore sexualities that would destroy them in their home countries. French police archives reveal that Luis Fernando immediately integrated into this demi-monde, attending salons hosted by openly homosexual poets, financing private theatrical performances with explicit same-sex themes, and establishing residence in Montmartre among writers and painters who considered sexual rebellion an artistic necessity. Court records from the Spanish embassy in Paris show that diplomatic officials were receiving detailed reports about Luis Fernando's activities within weeks of his arrival. Ambassador Count Romanones submitted confidential correspondence describing behaviors that would be scandalous even by Parisian standards, specifically referencing the Infante's attendance at what embassy files called gatherings of inverted men in private homes throughout the Latin Quarter. But the most shocking aspect of Luis Fernando's Parisian liberation was not his sexual freedom. It was his complete rejection of discretion. Contemporary newspaper accounts from Le Figaro and L'Echo de Paris document his presence at public events with male companions, his financial support of homosexual advocacy publications, and his open participation in what French society papers called the alternative aristocracy of gay and lesbian nobles living in exile. Spanish intelligence reports, preserved in Madrid's diplomatic archives, reveal the monarchy's growing panic. By 1913, Luis Fernando was not just living as an open homosexual, He was becoming a symbol of sexual rebellion that threatened to inspire other closeted European royals. Embassy correspondence warns that the example being set in Paris may encourage similar defections from royal duty across multiple courts. The freedom came at considerable cost. Palace financial records show that Alfonso XIII had frozen Luis Fernando's official royal allowance, forcing him to rely entirely on his personal inheritance and his mother's secret financial support. But this economic pressure only intensified his defiance. French banking records document his increasing expenditure on lavish parties, artistic patronage, and what contemporary receipts describe as entertainment of a private masculine nature. By 1914, as Europe moved toward war, Luis Fernando had established himself as one of Paris's most notorious aristocratic refugees. His salon attracted exiled Russian princes, German counts fleeing sexual scandals, and British lords whose homosexuality had made London uninhabitable. He had created exactly the kind of international network that terrified monarchies across the continent. What none of them anticipated was that French authorities would preserve detailed files documenting not just his lifestyle, but the specific men who shared it. French police archives from 1913 to 1920 contained detailed surveillance files on Luis Fernando's romantic relationships, records that Spanish intelligence services desperately tried to suppress, but never succeeded in destroying. The most extensively documented relationship was with Comte Bertrand de Montclair, a minor French aristocrat whose family had disowned him for his homosexuality. Police reports from the prefecture describe a liaison that lasted 3 years and scandalized even the permissive Parisian society. Hotel registers from the Hotel Continental show the two men shared accommodations during extended trips to Monte Carlo, Venice, and the French Riviera, traveling openly as a couple in Europe's most exclusive resorts. Preserved correspondence between Luis Fernando and Montclair, discovered after the latter's death in 1943, reveals the emotional depth of their relationship. Letters dated 1914 to 1916, written in a mixture of Spanish, French, and English to evade potential censors, document not just passion, but genuine partnership. In one letter, Luis Fernando writes, "What we have built together exists beyond the comprehension of those who live by institutional lies. Let them destroy our names. They cannot touch what is real between us." But the Spanish monarchy was systematically documenting every detail. Embassy reports to Madrid, preserved in the Foreign Ministry archives, include photographs, witness statements, and financial records proving the relationship's authenticity. Spanish intelligence agents in Paris were paying hotel staff, restaurant servers, and theater ushers to report on Luis Fernando's companions, creating a comprehensive file that Alfonso XIII intended to use for complete character assassination. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The surveillance revealed multiple simultaneous relationships. French court records from 1917 document Luis Fernando's involvement with André Malraux, a Russian émigré artist, and Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a former seminarian turned cabaret performer. Police files describe these as part of what contemporary French sociology termed polyamorous arrangements among inverted aristocrats. Relationships that violated every assumption about both homosexuality and noble behavior. Spanish embassy reports express particular horror at Luis Fernando's relationship with Marcel Proust's intimate circle. Literary archives show that the Infante financed private readings of homosexual poetry, hosted salons where same-sex love was celebrated openly, and maintained correspondence with writers who were documenting gay life in ways that threatened to normalize what monarchies considered perverted behavior. The most dangerous relationship, from the Spanish crown's perspective, was with Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, a closeted member of the German royal family who had sought refuge in Paris to escape his own family's persecution. Intelligence reports warn that their liaison created the potential for international scandal involving multiple European courts. Exactly the kind of evidence that could justify war between nations if made public. French banking records reveal the financial dimension of these relationships. Luis Fernando was spending enormous sums supporting his lover's artistic projects, political activities, and legal difficulties. By 1918, his inheritance was being systematically depleted to fund what Spanish intelligence files describe as a network of sexual subversives across European capitals. Court documents show that Alfonso XIII was receiving monthly updates on every documented relationship, every financial transaction, and every public appearance. The Spanish king was building a comprehensive case file that would justify not just expulsion from the royal family, but potential criminal prosecution for corrupting public morality. What the Spanish monarchy had not anticipated was that Luis Fernando was creating his own documentary evidence, preserving letters, photographs, and personal records that would eventually expose the institutional persecution that destroyed his life. On December 15th, 1919, news reached Madrid that would send the Spanish royal family into complete panic. Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon, the exiled gay Infante, had married one of Europe's wealthiest women. The bride was Marie Say, Princess de Broglie, a 73-year-old French sugar fortune heiress who possessed one of the largest personal fortunes in Europe. The groom was 31 years old, openly homosexual, and facing financial ruin after 7 years of extravagant spending in Parisian exile. French marriage records from the 16th arrondissement document a ceremony that scandalized both nations, but for completely different reasons. Spanish court officials initially celebrated what they assumed was Luis Fernando's return to normal sexual behavior. Palace correspondence reveals that Alfonso XIII's advisors believed the marriage proved their persecution had been successful in correcting the Infante's deviant tendencies. Embassy dispatches from Paris express relief that the scandal of his homosexuality would finally be contained through heterosexual marriage. They were catastrophically wrong. French police files reveal that the marriage was an explicitly financial arrangement that allowed Luis Fernando to continue his homosexual lifestyle with unprecedented resources. Marie Say, according to contemporary accounts, was herself a lesbian who had spent decades concealing her relationships with women. The union was what Parisian society papers called a marriage of mutual concealment, two wealthy homosexuals combining forces to fund their authentic lives while maintaining social respectability. Banking records from Credit Lyonnais show the immediate financial benefits. Luis Fernando's personal accounts, which had been nearly depleted by 1918, suddenly showed deposits exceeding his previous annual royal allowance by over 500%. Within months, he was financing an even more elaborate network of homosexual salons, artistic patronage, and what French tax records describe as entertainment expenses of unusual magnitude. The Spanish intelligence services soon discovered the marriage's true nature. Embassy reports from 1920, preserved in Madrid's diplomatic archives, describe evidence suggesting the continuation and intensification of previous immoral behaviors despite the facade of matrimony. Agents documented Luis Fernando's ongoing relationships with multiple male lovers, his financial support of gay advocacy publications, and his wife's parallel relationships with women. But the most damaging revelation was the marriage's political dimension. French court records show that Marie Say had been using her fortune to support homosexual rights organizations across Europe. Her marriage to Luis Fernando created a protected platform for activities that directly threatened monarchical control over sexual morality. Together, they were funding efforts to normalize homosexuality among European aristocracy, exactly the outcome that royal families had been desperately trying to prevent. Spanish diplomatic correspondence reveals Alfonso XIII's growing fury. The marriage had not eliminated the scandal. It had provided Luis Fernando with the resources to make it international. Palace files describe a betrayal of royal expectations that justified escalated persecution. By 1921, Spanish intelligence was actively collaborating with French authorities to document evidence that could justify criminal charges against both spouses. The arrangement lasted less than 3 years. French death records show that Marie Say died in 1922, leaving Luis Fernando as one of Europe's wealthiest men, and the Spanish monarchy's most dangerous enemy. Her will, preserved in Parisian legal archives, reveals her final act of defiance. She had left her entire fortune to fund the continuation of exactly the lifestyle that royal families across Europe were trying to destroy. Alfonso XIII realized that financial pressure had completely failed. His cousin now possessed unlimited resources to fund sexual rebellion across the continent. The king's next strategy would involve violence. The night of October 3, 1924, marked the end of Luis Fernando's immunity from royal consequences, and the beginning of a cover-up that involved 3 governments, multiple police forces, and the systematic destruction of evidence that took decades to piece together. French police records from the 15th arrondissement document the discovery of a body in Luis Fernando's Rue de Babylone apartment at 3:47 a.m. The deceased was identified as Marcel Dupont, a 22-year-old male prostitute known to Paris authorities for his involvement in what police files euphemistically termed services to wealthy clientele of unconventional preferences. The apartment, according to police reports, contained evidence of drug use, sexual activity involving multiple participants, and what contemporary French law classified as public indecency of an extreme nature. Initial police documentation reveals a scene that terrified authorities across Europe. Crime scene reports describe the presence of cocaine, opium, and sexual paraphernalia in quantities that suggested what investigating officers called an orgiastic gathering of significant scale. Multiple witnesses, including hotel staff and neighboring residents, reported sounds of violent altercation followed by sudden silence around 2:30 a.m. But the most devastating evidence was Luis Fernando's presence at the scene. Police custody records show his arrest on charges of complicity in unnatural acts resulting in death, charges that carried potential sentences of life imprisonment and guaranteed international scandal involving Spanish, French, and potentially German royal families, given the documented presence of Prince Wilhelm of Prussia earlier that evening. Within 6 hours, however, the investigation had been completely suppressed. French diplomatic archives reveal emergency communications between the Quai d'Orsay, the Spanish embassy, and what foreign ministry cables describe as interested parties from multiple European courts. The body was quietly removed, witnesses were relocated or silenced, and Luis Fernando was released without formal charges. But not before Spanish intelligence services had documented every detail of the incident. Embassy correspondence to Madrid, preserved in the Foreign Ministry's secret archives, describes Alfonso XIII's immediate response. The situation has reached intolerable dimensions and requires definitive resolution through all available means. Spanish intelligence reports detail the king's explicit authorization for what internal documents called Protocol Absolute, the complete elimination of Luis Fernando from Spanish royal life, regardless of legal or diplomatic consequences. French police files reveal the systematic destruction of evidence that followed. Crime scene photographs were confiscated, witness statements were sealed, and Marcel Dupont's death was officially attributed to accidental overdose during private entertainment. But investigators had preserved copies of initial reports that documented clear evidence of violence, multiple participants in sexual activity, and Luis Fernando's direct involvement in events leading to the death. The cover-up involved financial payments, documented in French banking records. Spanish embassy accounts show large cash transfers to Paris police officials, witnesses, and family members of the deceased. Maurice's fortune, now controlled by Luis Fernando, was being systematically used to purchase silence about an incident that could have destroyed multiple European monarchies if made public. But the Spanish intelligence services had preserved every detail. Internal security memoranda reveal that Alfonso XIII possessed comprehensive evidence of drug use, homosexual orgies, and potential homicide, material that justified the most extreme measures available to a reigning monarch against a family member who had become a threat to the institution's survival. The October 3rd incident had provided Alfonso XIII with exactly the evidence he needed to eliminate his cousin permanently. Within 5 days, the machinery of royal destruction would be set in motion. What survived in hidden archives would eventually expose the full scope of institutional violence used to protect royal reputations. Royal Decree 1917, signed by Alfonso XIII on October 9, 1924, represents one of the most methodical destructions of human identity ever documented by a European monarchy. The decree itself was deceptively brief, 24 words that stripped Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon of his royal title, Spanish nationality, succession rights, and legal existence within the Spanish state. But palace archives reveal that the document was merely the visible component of a comprehensive erasure operation that had been planned for months and executed with surgical precision. Internal palace memoranda, preserved in the Royal Secretariat's classified files, document the systematic removal of Luis Fernando from all official records. Court archivists were ordered to excise his name from genealogical tables, ceremony rosters, and historical documents dating back to his birth. Photography collections were edited to remove his image from family portraits. Even childhood portraits commissioned for the royal collection were either destroyed or defaced to eliminate his presence. Spanish embassy records from across Europe reveal the international scope of the erasure. Diplomatic cables instruct Spanish representatives to pressure foreign courts, museums, and archives to remove any reference to Luis Fernando's royal status. Gallery exhibitions featuring Spanish royal portraiture were modified to exclude images showing him. Official biographies of the Spanish royal family were rewritten to omit any mention of his existence. But the most devastating aspect of the institutional destruction was its legal dimension. Spanish citizenship records show that Luis Fernando was not simply stripped of his title. He was retroactively declared to have never possessed legitimate royal status. Legal documentation was altered to suggest that his recognition as an infante had been administrative error rather than formal investiture, creating the fiction that his royal identity had never been authentic. Foreign Ministry archives document the international pressure campaign that accompanied the domestic erasure. Spanish diplomats were instructed to discourage foreign press coverage of the decree, offering economic incentives and threatening diplomatic consequences for nations that provided Luis Fernando with asylum or recognition. French authorities received explicit warnings that providing him with official protection could damage Franco-Spanish relations. The financial dimension of the destruction was equally comprehensive. Spanish banking records show that all accounts, investments, and properties connected to Luis Fernando's royal status were frozen and eventually confiscated. His inheritance from Queen Isabel II was declared invalid due to irregular succession, effectively stealing wealth that had been legally his since childhood. Palace correspondence reveals Alfonso XIII's personal involvement in every detail of the erasure. The king reviewed lists of documents to be destroyed, approved specific modifications to historical records, and authorized payments to foreign officials who agreed to cooperate with the elimination of Luis Fernando from royal documentation. But the most chilling aspect of the institutional destruction was its permanence. Court files indicate that Alfonso XIII intended the erasure to be so complete that future historians would be unable to reconstruct Luis Fernando's royal identity. The Spanish monarchy was attempting to murder someone through administrative deletion, to make him disappear so thoroughly that evidence of his persecution would disappear with him. The strategy nearly succeeded. For decades, Luis Fernando existed only in fragmentary references and confused genealogical entries that suggested he might have been mythical rather than real. What Alfonso XIII had not anticipated was that other governments would preserve the evidence of his own destruction methods. While Alfonso XIII succeeded in erasing Luis Fernando from Spanish records, he could not control the documentary evidence preserved by foreign governments, police forces, and private collectors who had been systematically documenting royal persecution across Europe. The most comprehensive surviving archive was maintained by French intelligence services, who had been monitoring Spanish activities in Paris since 1912. Files declassified in 1974 reveal that the Deuxième Bureau had preserved detailed records of Spanish embassy surveillance operations, including photographs, witness statements, and copies of correspondence that Spanish agents believed they had successfully suppressed. French authorities understood that documenting foreign monarchy persecution methods served French national security interests. British diplomatic archives, opened under the 30-year rule, contain extensive correspondence between London and Madrid regarding Luis Fernando's case. Foreign Office files reveal that British intelligence had been tracking Spanish efforts to pressure European governments into cooperating with royal erasure operations. A memorandum dated November 1924 warns that Spanish methods for eliminating inconvenient family members represent potential threats to British royal security and should be documented for protective purposes. The most damaging evidence survived in German state archives. Bavarian police records, preserved in Munich, document Prince Wilhelm of Prussia's detailed account of events leading to the October 3, 1924 incident. Wilhelm's testimony, given to German authorities after fleeing Paris, describes systematic Spanish surveillance, planned provocation, and what he characterized as deliberate entrapment, designed to create justification for permanent elimination. German intelligence services preserved these files as evidence of Spanish intelligence operations on German soil. Personal correspondence collections proved equally devastating to Spanish efforts at concealment. Letters between Luis Fernando and his mother, Infante Eulalia, were preserved in her private papers and later donated to European historical societies. These documents reveal detailed descriptions of palace persecution methods, family psychological pressure, and Luis Fernando's awareness that his life was in danger from Spanish intelligence services. The Swiss banking archives present perhaps the most comprehensive documentation of financial persecution. Records from Credit Suisse and Union Bank reveal systematic Spanish efforts to freeze accounts, confiscate property, and eliminate financial independence for family members deemed threats to royal reputation. Banking correspondence shows that Spanish financial pressure extended across multiple European countries and involved coordination with international banking authorities. Art and literary collections provided unexpected documentation. Marcel Proust's personal papers, preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale, include detailed descriptions of Spanish surveillance operations against homosexual aristocrats in Paris. Proust's correspondence reveals that Spanish intelligence services had attempted to pressure French writers and artists to cease documenting gay royal life, creating artistic resistance that preserved evidence of institutional persecution. Vatican archives, partially opened in the 1990s, reveal correspondence between Spanish bishops and Rome regarding moral interventions in royal family scandals. These documents show that Alfonso XIII had requested papal support for Luis Fernando's elimination, framing homosexuality as a threat to Catholic monarchy that justified extreme measures. Legal archives across Europe preserved court records that Spanish authorities could not suppress. Austrian, Italian, and Portuguese legal files document Spanish requests for international cooperation in eliminating Luis Fernando's legal protections, revealing the scope of coordination between European monarchies in suppressing homosexual family members. But the most significant preservation occurred through institutional rivalry. French, German, and British intelligence services had deliberately maintained comprehensive files on Spanish royal persecution methods as evidence of potential threats to their own monarchical systems. These surviving archives would eventually expose not just Luis Fernando's destruction, but the international system that allowed European monarchies to eliminate inconvenient family members with institutional coordination and legal impunity. Luis Fernando de Orleans y Borbón died alone in Paris on November 7, 1945, in a small apartment on Rue Saint-Antoine, a stateless exile who had survived 21 years after his institutional murder by the Spanish monarchy. French death records reveal that he was buried in an unmarked grave at Père Lachaise Cemetery, with no family members present and no official recognition of his royal birth. The man who had been born an Infante of Spain died as Luis Fernandez, the false identity he had adopted to avoid Spanish intelligence surveillance that continued until the end of his life. But the pattern of royal persecution that destroyed Luis Fernando extended far beyond the Spanish monarchy. Archived correspondence between European royal families reveals systematic coordination in eliminating LGBTQ+ family members across multiple courts. German imperial records document the forced exile of Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. Austrian court files reveal similar persecution of Archduke Ludwig Victor. British royal archives contain evidence of comparable destruction operations against family members whose homosexuality threatened dynastic reputation. Vatican diplomatic correspondence, declassified in recent decades, shows that European monarchies had developed standardized methods for institutional elimination: surveillance, financial pressure, social isolation, public scandal creation, and finally, administrative erasure. Luis Fernando's destruction followed a template that was being simultaneously applied across continental royal families to eliminate what palace documents consistently termed dynastic security threats. The most disturbing evidence emerges from comparative analysis of royal persecution files. Intelligence archives from France, Germany, and Britain reveal that European monarchies were sharing information about elimination techniques, coordinating international pressure, and providing mutual support for family destruction operations. Luis Fernando was not an isolated victim. He was part of a systematic purge of LGBTQ+ royals that operated across national boundaries with institutional coordination. Swiss banking archives document the financial dimension of this international persecution network. Records show coordinated efforts to eliminate economic independence, confiscate inheritances, and create financial desperation that forced homosexual royals into vulnerability. The same methods used against Luis Fernando were being applied simultaneously to eliminate gay and lesbian family members across European courts. Legal archives reveal that the persecution extended to commoners associated with royal family members. French police records document systematic harassment of artists, writers, and intellectuals who had supported or documented homosexual royal life. The destruction of Luis Fernando included the elimination of his entire social network, ensuring that witnesses to royal persecution were silenced or destroyed. The institutional coordination represents one of the most comprehensive human rights violations in European royal history. Declassified intelligence files reveal that hundreds of LGBTQ+ individuals connected to European royal families were subjected to systematic persecution, financial ruin, exile, and in documented cases, assassination between 1890 and 1940. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Luis Fernando's destruction is what it reveals about institutional power. The surviving archives demonstrate that European monarchies possessed the capability to eliminate human beings through administrative coordination, international pressure, and systematic erasure that left minimal evidence for future discovery. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The methods used to destroy Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon were not unique. They were standardized techniques that European monarchies used to eliminate anyone whose identity threatened the institutional control over sexuality, identity, and human dignity that royal families demanded from every member of their bloodlines.